Hey everyone, I'm Jack.
And I'm Alex.
And in today's video, we'll be ranking the bosses of Marvel's Spider-Man and Spider-Man Miles Morales from worst to best as a part of our first ever multi-game boss ranking. For as long as time, the endless debate over who's the greatest superhero between Batman and Spider-Man has held firm in all facets of media, be it films, television, comics, and recently, games. While Spider-Man had a few decent showings in the 5th and 6th console generations with the Sam Raimi Spider-Man movie game Shattered Dimensions and Web of Shadows, the Batman Arkham series easily became the most acclaimed and successful superhero games of all time. With that said, in 2018, Sony's Spider-Man solo game immediately made rounds with its similarly epic story and gameplay, quickly garnering notoriety as a direct rival with Arkham City for the title of the objective best superhero game in history.
With the recent remaster on PS5 for Spider-Man and its ensuing sequel of sorts, Miles Morales, Jack and I found it was right for us to rank the bosses of both games together, seeing as their stories are now converging in Spider-Man 2 coming next year. We originally intended on making two separate videos, however there simply wasn't enough substance to cover ground for Miles Morales on its own, seeing as there's only 4 bosses within it. Either way, as two of the most successful and high-quality superhero titles in recent times, the bosses that follow live up to expectation and deliver almost entirely across the board. With all that said, let's get into it.
Yeah, this probably isn't much of a surprise. A good comparison would be any boss from a Souls game with a horrible run-up. With practice, the Taskmaster challenges get somewhat formulaic, even easy, but practice means hours, and literal dozens of attempts on that one drone trial that took me more time to beat than getting plat on the Force Unleashed 2. Back to my Souls game analogy, the reason I say that is because inherently none of those bosses, well, some, but the majority of those bosses aren't particularly bad at all, just not rewarding given the circumstances. This is exactly the same. You have to go through multiple hours of repetitive gimmick-based challenges for the grand reward of a fight with your average Joe. I spent even less time than normal because I had quad damage equipped, but I got the gist of the fight, and after doing it all over again on New Game Plus, my opinion was only further solidified. I'll be clear and say that this is actually an okay fight, just disappointing given the amount of effort required to unlock it as well as the failing of the Taskmaster character inherently. Still much better than Black Widow's flaccid attempt.
The change in gameplay from 3D to 2D was a neat gimmick and would have made for a cool segment of a multi-phase fight, but I think this encounter is a little bit dragged out. Dodging is as simple as gesturing the joystick one way or another, and this is simply not engaging enough to warrant as much screen time as it had. The ending is a neat callback to Spider-Man 2, which for the record is one of my favorite movies of all time, and I think the best superhero movie of all time. Back on topic, I will say that Mr. Negative's prominent role in the game was interesting since I didn't know or follow basically anything about the comics before playing on release. He was unfamiliar to me, so he felt a lot fresher than the other villains, even if they also had original spins on their classic counterparts. Nothing in this fight blows me away, as I said, but it's not unpleasant by any means and is a decent spectacle, which is more than plenty of bosses can say.
I'm not a big fan of physically immune villains. Another example would be Darth Sion from Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic 2, although I will say that this is my favorite take on his character. I don't know, I'm not a big fan of the Ivan Drago hair. And as the grungiest version of Lonnie Lincoln, you end up fighting in a Bayside hideout for Tombstone's gang after a short, somewhat eventful side mission. Like any oversized enemy, enough webs will keep him stationary and open him up to a short combo, rinse, and repeat. Of course, there's more to it. He features an AoE in the first phase, and when members of his gang begin to file in, the intensity level rises, but it's nothing that crazy. When Spider-Man hits him with a short whiff of an anti-drug of grave dust, the fight opens up a bit more with the hammer being replaced by a flaming chain link, and the tells are much harder than the hammer seeing as only his arm moves to swing the weapon. In a similar vein to Arkham Knight, knocking out minor but still significant villains from Spider-Man's gargantuan rogues gallery is extremely satisfying, and Tombstone, as one of the more notable members of that group, goes down as a decent boss in the grand scheme of things.
This fight is grossly overrated in my opinion, which I attribute to it featuring two big-name bogeys. At its core, this fight is just tapping Triangle, punching Vulture, and webbing Electro. It's not unpleasant or anything, but I'm still of the unpopular opinion that this game's bosses are almost entirely dead average, with very few leaving a big impression on me beyond their story impact. I think these games have better combat than the Arkham games for the most part, but with the bosses you really start to feel the lack of fight variety. My number one issue with the game is that the combat feels repetitive because every enemy is so similar, save for differences like how many hits they take or if they can fly or something. Attacks all feel uniform because there's the one-size-fits-all solution of just mashing the dodge button when your spider senses are tingling and not really thinking about it. There's no memorizing of movesets or strategies you pick up beyond mashing square when the guy isn't punching you and then performing a laughably easy quick time stunt to cap stuff off. As I said with Mr. Negative, there's nothing I hate about fighting these two, but I'm never really hyped to square off against him either.
Embarrassingly, or maybe not, I had no idea who Shocker was until I played this game. I did some research on Herman Schultz after the fight, and his character's just really sad. First of all, his entire arc on Earth 616 is basically losing to Spider-Man and going from point A to point B through the consequences of whatever event he lost in. As well, he's bipolar, fluctuating between extremely cocky and passive like a neutered dog, and it's clear which end of the spectrum he's on for this encounter. I like the cutscene that begins this fight. It puts into perspective how much power his gauntlets actually hold, and the feats he pulls off during the fight continue to prove that. I'd say there's no definite strategy to beating Shocker, more of a game of whatever feels most comfortable. For me, I found it best to aimlessly swing around the bank and take my openings when they presented themselves. This is true for both phases, although with the bits and pieces of the ceiling falling from the ceiling thanks to his increased aggression in phase 2, by swinging around you run the risk of getting hit unavoidably. Generally speaking, the second phase is the same as the first with an increase in amplitude in terms of his energy output. However, for a fairly unknown villain when compared to the majority of other featuring bosses in these two games, Shocker stands out that much more.
I thought this fight accomplished what it set out to do pretty well. It's a fun introduction to Venom powers, which I think served as the missing ingredient to make the combat of the first Spider-Man more engaging. The romp through the mall, though impossible to fail as far as I could tell, was a fun sequence and gave the game good momentum in its first few minutes. In practice, you aren't doing much besides Venom punching Rhino in the head and then mashing square, but that's fair enough for the first boss of Miles' campaign, and it's not like the others are that much more complex anyways.
While perhaps the most accurate mix of both comic-based and real-life Kingpin in recent memory, it's also the least entertaining interpretation of the lot by a good deal. As you learn soon after this fight in the First Fist construction zone, Kingpin is actually just a reskinned big man with a noticeable buff in damage, aggression, and speed, with the addition of turrets to provide a more thorough example of how to evade bullets. That being said, the atmosphere and characterization of Kingpin was absolutely nailed in this fight, and his roots in sumo wrestling as found in the comics are paid homage to through his vast collection of Japanese art and samurai armor. I personally find comic-based designs of villains fascinating in games. Take Scarecrow from Arkham Asylum, as it gives life and persona to panels on reread you wouldn't get otherwise. However, just to say it, this interpretation is playing second fiddle to Vincent D'Onofrio, I don't know. The Kingpin from Daredevil. He's better than this one. However, seeing this true to the Amazing Spider-Man reverb was greatly exciting, and his social power found throughout not only the rest of the game and its following DLCs, but in Miles Morales as well, furthers the MO of his wide-scale influence and power. With an absolutely fantastic QuickTime event to finish, sadly one of few found across both games, the fact that Wilson Fisk is a mid to bottom boss is only confirmation to the overall quality of these games' fights.
I find it odd how you fight Rhino 3 times when all's said and done. Is he somebody in Insomniac's favorite villain or something? He's sort of like a discount TF2 heavy to me, so I'm not sure why they had him of all people keep coming back out of the entire Rogues gallery. That said, this fight is solid. I found Rocks on Rhino rather frustrating, but it was admittedly largely due to user error, and I respect it at least evoked some kind of emotion in me, even if that emotion was rage, unlike a lot of the other fights. There's a lot of room to maneuver, and Venom punching him at full force is as impactful as ever. Unfortunately, it's one of those bosses where they summon normal enemies into the fray, and those just aren't my thing. The guys who lock your Venom use just drag the fight to be super lengthy, which makes the core fight weaker as well. It's fine for a bit, but 10 minutes plus of Rhino combat gets old and leaves the fight in the middle of the pack for us.
As a prerequisite, while one of the game's highlights, we are not counting the illusion sequence that sets up this fight, even though technically it's a part of the boss as Scorpion's injected poison causes the trip. Nonetheless, the significance of this fight relative to the game's main story, with the two rogues collectively making one of 3 major outbreaks across New York City as part of Dr. Octopus's Sinister Six, was extremely vital. As well, after some research, I actually found that in the original Amazing Spider-Man comic run, issue number 319 from 1989 actually pits Spider-Man against a team of Rhino and Scorpion, as well as a character named Blacklash who was originally, before changing his name, Whiplash. There also is just a Blacklash, and further there's female and male variants known as both Whiplash and Blacklash. It's just a mess. And without one of the MCU's worst villains, Rhino and Scorpion, while not a traditional gank, works extremely well as a pair within Spider-Man's mechanics. For the first bit of the fight, Scorpion doesn't even show up, it's just you versus Rhino in a very wide arena full of convenient materials used to stun him into a combo. The positional and strategic implications of this phase makes it memorable and once again works extremely well within the mechanical confines of this game, just as the Rhinos of Miles Morales do with Venom powers. With Scorpion's introduction, Rhino stays the same, however there's now a mix of vision impairing poison attacks throughout, and you also have to knock out Scorpion through the generic webs in combo. While I am a bit more lenient with the Electro and Vulture fight than Alex is, it is still levels worse than Rhino and Scorpion, who together make the best 2-villain fight in the series so far.
I honestly appreciate this fight's simplicity. I know I ragged on other bosses for being barren, but the trick here is that there's actual effort required to win, so it's not just a repetitive snooze fest. Dodge crap, web him, and punch him. Nice and sweet, no foo-foo crap to it. This keeps it from reaching the heights that some more intricate encounters do, but I think it gives him a solid base to work with. As to why Tombstone isn't higher, even though he's kind of got the same thing going on, I actually like Tombstone a good deal more than Jack does, so I personally see these fights as being more or less in the same league. Hammerhead is a likable villain and has a fun fight, so I've got no qualms with him.
After the not-so-surprising twist that a really good man was actually quite evil and destructive, ever heard that one before, Martin Li's Requiem in D minor per se was an essential part of Spider-Man's conclusion. Mr. Negative was a surprising choice of lead antagonist in my opinion, seeing as the character was only recently introduced in a limited free comic book day issue of The Amazing Spider-Man in 2007. And once again, I'd argue that another one of this game's character narratives beats out comic origins, with this version of Martin Li holding much more emotional weight than the generally undefined Earth-616 human trafficker Martin Li. Yeah. After seeing that Mr. Negative was more of a repercussion of abuse and his alter ego, Martin Li was a victim of Norman Osborn's inhumane Devil's Breath trials, this fight felt much more meaningful to the game's exposition, as Devil's Breath at this point became less of an Arkham Knight sort of create hell for chaos and more of an act of vengeance against the man who ruined an innocent child's life. With the grand reveal of Mr. Negative's origins, Spider-Man's no-killing rule and the dilemma it creates is in full effect throughout this encounter, with Spider-Man admittedly stating that Osborn deserves justice and that Li has every right to kill him, but it would be against his honor code to let that happen. The first bit actually in the lab is similar to most overpowered enemy fights in that it's a waiting game until he tires out from the overloading of Dark Force and Light Force and you strike while he's down. When he quite literally unleashes his inner demon and you enter the dream sequence, the fight gets a bit similar to the very first dream sequence well back in the early portion of the story, with of course the addition of a negative energy Fortnite Storm King that once beaten leads back to the same fight as was in the lab. As the direct precursor to Otto Octavius's true immersion as Dr. Octopus, the intensity and emotions behind Martin Li's character in his last gasp attempt at ending the man who destroyed him holds firm as one of the Spider-Man game's greatest moments.
Scripting this video was really tricky for me for a number of reasons. One of them is that I just don't have much to say about the majority of these bosses, but another is that I can't think of any quips Spider-Man didn't already beat me to. Half the stuff I think of to poke fun at the bosses is just Peter Parker's sloppy seconds, and I'm no plagiarist. That said, I think it's a public domain joke to say that this look for Hammerhead is pretty funny looking. Very lanky and awkward. Not a problem at all, just an observation. This fight is awesome since you get to do a little brain surgery with that giant laser sable rig to her ship, not to mention busting up his robotic kneecaps. This fight is satisfying if I had to use one word to describe it. Very nice way to cap off the DLC story and very nice finisher in the ending. Flying a plane straight into him is just the kind of over-the-top ridiculousness I'd expect out of Metal Gear Rising or something, which rules. The formula of webbing and then beating him up is still the core here, but the added sprinkles make this the superior Hammerhead encounter between the two.
Miles Morales, essentially a $60 DLC for Spider-Man, features a story so short barely 3 run-throughs of Morbius covers the time required to beat it. While a 2-hour movie can create lovable, emotionally relatable, and just enjoyable characters such as Milo, with a game so short and entirely centered around Finn and Miles, Prowler's role is minor at best and filled in for the sake of connections at worst. That isn't to say I dislike Aaron Davis, he's actually one of my favorite characters in the long list of featuring personalities in Spider-Man media, but the emotions of this fight weren't as deep as intended, and because of that, the boss feels like simply a boss. As a Red Hood-esque anti-hero, Prowler knows the consequences of, as put, going too far, or rather killing, putting yourself in a perilous situation where murder is your only escape. Out of fear for his nephew and the major problem arising with the Tinkerer, the Underground, and Roxxon, he locks you in an L-Train bunker until you escape, beginning the fight. This really is just an extremely well-made duel between two superhumans, rivaling and also serving as a great comparison to the Deathstroke boss from Arkham Origins. Uncle Aaron's moveset is entirely based around the Prowler suit's abilities, including invisibility, lasers, and eventually in the later phases, physical body manipulation through clones of himself. As about as high-flying as generally low-power superhero battles come, the Prowler fight is a great ending to Aaron Davis' arc in the first story, and the gameplay alone makes it deserving of a top 3 spot.
I'm gonna be brutally honest. Neither Jack nor I gave 2 flying f***s about the Tinkerer's story. I actually liked the Prowler storyline a lot, so that one took precedence for me over Finn's. The fight is, however, by far the best from a gameplay perspective. Multiple phases, attack memorization, and visual flair cover all the complaints I addressed in some previous fights, and it's the most entertaining as well. There are a lot of details like the way the camera slants when you're swinging around, avoiding saw blades and stuff that really makes it feel cinematic and engaging to a degree unlike any other fight in the game. It's fast-paced, do-or-die mayhem at its finest. The arena is great looking too, nice neon coloring similar to the Tinkerer's own armor. However, the reason this isn't number 1 is because story factors so majorly into the quality of this game. Our number 1, who you all probably saw coming a mile away, is just leaps and bounds beyond this one in terms of build-up, payoff, and staying power. This here is a conflict that thinks it's way more fascinating than it is. Pseudo-deep is the term I like to use, which I vaguely define as something that was clearly intended to be profound, but is just run-of-the-mill schlock any moron could come up with. For reference, some common examples I see in day-to-day life are people who think, bro, the universe is so big and we're like insignificant, bro, and dude, when you think about it, morality is like subjective and art is in the eye of the beholder. This is just the story writing equivalent of that, which can be easily simplified to, bro, they're friends, but when their ideals clash, they're like enemies, but deep down they still care for each other. At the end of the day, right and wrong really isn't as black and white, and sometimes the bad guys make a little sense. I've played through Miles Morales twice this year, and I can barely remember the context of this fight beyond the basics a mere month after rebeating it. In contrast, I played the first game around when the final DLC released in 2019. Despite 3 or so years of difference, I still remembered all the nitty-gritty of that fight and its details when I began my second playthrough earlier in 2022. I've been pretty harsh on the Tinkerer, somewhat for the sake of comedy. There are some nice touches like the theme being a remix of the Best Friends theme Finn has earlier in the game, and it does accomplish the goal of teaching Miles the true weight of being Spider-Man like Peter learned with Ock. It's just a bit rote and flat in my opinion. For stellar gameplay, the Tinkerer takes home a respectable silver medal, but is a long way off from a Pulitzer.
As if there was anybody else fit for the top spot, the game's supporting protagonist and eventual lead antagonist, Otto Octavius, is by far the best boss and story arc across the Spider-Man series so far. As Alex said, while Tinkerer as just inherently a boss in a game's mechanics sense is arguably better, keep in mind that meaning all narrative, emotions, and character development being irrelevant, that's purposefully an extremely specified and generally unwarranted handicap. As an event, the emotional gravitas this holds, a man struggling for life, infected by his own creation, forever changed due to unintentional misfortune from trying to impact the world for the better, is one of, if not the most richly emotional moment in the history of superhero games, only rivaled by the Joker's death in Arkham City. The visuals of the fight alongside the 10+ hour build-up create a necessarily climactic setting that ultimately leads to Doc Ock's confirmation of his suspected Spider-Man identity. In tandem, there was an unmatched level of satisfaction that came with concluding the game's story and Otto's individual narrative within it, his gradual physical decline up to his maniacal switch to Dr. Octopus, and with that, his loss of morals, values, and goals replaced by a desire for absolute power and the death of Spider-Man. With the anti-Ock suit, you fight on the rooftop of Oscorp, and in the PS5 remaster, this is one of the most graphically mesmerizing bosses I have ever seen. Each of his mechanical limbs gets slowly entwined with webs until you force him to destroy the building's radar tower, causing a literal floor is lava situation. I really enjoyed these bits because of how vastly different they are from the normal combat sequences leading into the fight ignoring gravity. This was so utterly unorthodox yet perfectly captures what a Spider-Man game's combat should be: cinematic, emotional, and of course fun through originality. With his defeat, Octavius gets stabbed in the midsection by his own mechanical limb, only surviving thanks to plot armor, although with his making it alive and well to the raft, I cannot wait to see his role in Spider-Man 2 coming in 2023, perhaps, or rather hopefully featuring the infamous Doc Ock bowl cut that's fallen out of favor as time has gone on. As one of the great superhero villains of all time, this boss fight matches his historic character, and the emotions, motivations, and story behind it make it without question the peak of the Spider-Man series.
Thanks so much for watching, and we hope you enjoyed. Next week I'll finally be covering Persona 5 Royal, my second favorite game of all time, so stay tuned if that's at all up your alley. That's all for now. Deuces.